Public Affairs very much thanks Residco, our sole corporate underwriter, for helping to make the production of this show possible.
But this should be on the governor's mind. Now, is he individually culpable and responsible if the state of Illinois, via him, has made a misrepresentation? Well, we'll leave the lawyers to decide that, but I would give it, Governor Pritzker, I would give it some attention, because you are talking about running for president indirectly or directly.
He's putting the state at legal risk.
That's not a good thing if you
No.
want to be president, even if you don't run for re-election. It's not a good thing.
No, and he, as I say, he's putting them at the whole state at legal risk. It's clear in the cease and desist order. Part of the remedies was that the governor and any elected official who's making comments about the financial condition of the government should be informed of what they need to say in order to not violate the anti-fraud provisions. The other place he's being dishonest is by saying that they have a balanced budget and that it's responsible balanced budget. Can you really, Jeff, have a balanced budget if you're shorting the pensions by $5 billion?
Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. We will not, well, we'll be doing some politics, but a lot of public policy, because we have just the right guest. We're dealing with, I shouldn't even tell you, it sounds a little bit eyes glaze over, pensions and accounting and things. If you see my recent shows, you know we're doing it. But that is so important. And we have just the right guest, because Sheila Weinberg, she is the founder and CEO of Truth in Accounting. There's nothing fuzzy, there's nothing difficult. Difficult in the sense she'll make it so easy to understand, because she is a national expert in the issues of accounting, private and government, and budget and finance, and all of that's wrapped into so much that's so important for the state of Illinois. We'll be focusing on. She knows all the country as well. But for the state of Illinois, she's got that down. She's got Chicago down. She's got downstate down. So get down with us, and don't move away. This is going to be a really, 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 really good show. So Sheila Weinberg, it's so important that people get from the get-go, their head around the notion that we have almost $250 billion in unfunded pensions, retirement debt, however we want to put it. The state is in a hole, in a sense, for $250 billion, counting state stuff in the city of Chicago. Mm-hmm. Is that sort of right? You agree? Have we gotten that
that's right. Another way to look at it is to look at it by, they have a cash shortfall in their pension plans. They don't have enough money to pay the benefits that they promise. Right. So therefore, they're going to have to cut the benefits, cut other government services or other benefits, or they're going to have to raise taxes and plug this $250 billion hole.
That's the math. That's the math. So when people say they disagree, I guess they disagree with math, because as you pointed out, if we have $250 billion that we're short on the state level, but the state level includes Chicago and other cities and counties as well, but most of this debt is either state debt, state unfunding of pensions, or city debt. Chicago swamps the other cities. There's a small amount throughout the state, and the ratio is about 170 billion of the 240 billion. Their eyes are glazing over already, but here's 70%. It's a 70% problem for the state of Illinois. They account for 70%, and then Chicago, most of the remaining 30%. So those numbers you can understand. It's a major problem. We'll get on why, but in the city of Chicago, come back to this, but the average household, if you're watching this in Chicago, is on the hook for $95,000. To get sort of even, you just take out your checkbook, write a check to the city of Chicago for $95K, and they'd almost be caught up with the what the actuaries say is the right amount.
Yes, and that you're saying the city of Chicago, but what you're talking about is a taxpayer who lives in the city of Chicago. They're not just on the hook for the city of Chicago's, they're also on the hook for the state of Illinois, the Park District, Cook County, for the municipal,
Right.
all these others,
So
all
you're right. It's
combined.
Chicago. Thanks for the correction. It's Chicago. If you live in Chicago, you live in Cook County. If you live in Chicago, you live in the state of Illinois. So you got the whole thing.
Yep, yep,
It's a very expensive place to live.
yeah.
If you want to get even, this would just even you up. You're going to have to pay more for other pensions in the future, but this would sort of catch you
That
up.
would get you, look at it as a credit card. It would be paying off your full credit card balance. And now what the city and the state and the other governments are choosing to do is pay it off over time. So again, they put it on the taxpayer's credit card, and in the future, the taxpayers are going to have to pay $95,000 to all of those entities just to catch up the old cost, not, as you say, any of the new cost.
And when I say downstate, a lot of people refer to it that way. Downstate means anything outside of Chicago, or anything at least outside of Chicago and Cook County. So Rockford's downstate, even though it's up north of us. And things to the west of us, I often, and many people say, downstate. And so if you live downstate, you don't have the Chicago or Cook County problem, but you do have the state of Illinois problem.
And you have
get
your
to
own
participate.
little individual government problem
You're
also.
like, right, Winnebago County, if you're in Rockford, other counties, there tend not to be anything like the issue of Chicago, and even Cook County is relatively small, I think, in terms of unfunded pension debt relative to Chicago. The main outliers in the country, Illinois, number one, Chicago, almost number one, maybe we're number one in being the worst.
Yeah, but I wouldn't let the downstate people be off the hook. What I'm saying is that each one of them have, for example, their own police and firefighter fund, and those are massively underfunded. Now they're small because they're only small entities, but by per taxpayer, it could be a very large amount. And for that individual entity, I've looked at individual villages, and their police and pension fire funds are underfunded by like 6 times payroll.
And
So those
you're
are large amounts.
You're absolutely right. For that individual city on the south side of Chicago or south of the city, they got a mayor, they got a village, they got a city that may be heading toward insolvency. They may have to, it's because they have such high unfunding of their pensions when they come due, if they don't want to go bankrupt, and they don't really have the ability currently to file for bankruptcy. The legislature could give them that ability, but those cities and villages can't, but they could go belly up, and
one thing
I was just saying, they won't be able to cover their police pension, which means they may want to say, if you want to cover your police pension, just cut back on the amount you're providing for current police spending, so you'll have less for current police, so you can pay your police pension.
And one thing that the state legislature just did and gave to all the little village police funds is they just increased those police funds benefits. So for example, the city of Chicago, the latest legislation during last session, they increased the city of Chicago's pension benefits, unfunded benefits, by $1.2 billion. And that happened with all of these governments
So
who have
across
police.
the board, increase in pensions, say in Chicago for all Chicago police?
Yep.
What was the rationale for doing it? Did they have any?
They wanted to give the police additional benefits. They wanted to
So-
keep those people happy.
If you're in Chicago, the $95,000 in the hole wasn't enough. They were shooting for 98,000 or 100,000 or something.
They just,
You can't make this up. I mean, who was responsible for that? Was the city council? Was the mayor? Somebody was responsible. if you're in Chicago, and you might want to have a sarcastic thank you note to all of the city council folks who voted for
And
it.
if
I
you
assume they
live
did.
in a village who has a police fire fund, a police fund, you should thank the state legislature for that also.
Okay, and so I mean, just going right to Illinois, the pension contributions fall short of the actuarially determined contributions. We've mentioned this before in one of our prior shows dealing with this issue, but in 2026, when Governor Pritzker said, I balanced the budget, which he said in a speech to the General Assembly in, I think, February 26th.
I'm proud to say that this year's budget proposal is balanced and responsible.
It's great, we balanced the budget, but he didn't say, but we only paid the statutorily required contribution, which isn't the amount that actuaries would say they have to pay to balance the budget, right?
Well, what he said is they're going to fully fund these certified amounts, and the certified amounts are based upon the statutorily required contribution. What this means is, let's say that, Jeff, you've gotten yourself into credit card debt. You decided, oh, I'm going to pay it off over time, but you don't want to have to pay the amount that the credit card company is saying. That would put a crunch into your budget. So instead of doing that, you come up with your own payment schedule. And then that amount is less than what the credit card company is saying you should pay. And what's going on here is the state in 1995 came up with what they called the Edgar ramp. They didn't want to fund the pensions. It's not a sexy thing to fund pensions. So they went ahead and said, oh, during the time we're in office, we'll go ahead and pay a little bit, but that will ramp up over time. And it's called the Edgar ramp just because the Governor Edgar was in office at the time. But that amount is less than what the state's pension plan's own actuaries say should go into the pension plan. So when he says this certified, the statutorily required contribution, was in 2016's budget, it's $5 billion less than what the actuaries say should go into it to fully fund it. But he's saying he's fully funding the amount, even though he's not fully funding what the actuaries say he should fund.
That's for the proposed fiscal year 2026 budget. So he's making, I think, well, you're not going to make the legal determination of what's a misrepresentation, but you are truth in accounting. Is the governor telling the truth when he says it's a balanced budget?
It is definitely misleading.
Definitely misleading.
Definitely
Some would
misleading.
say misrepresentation. That may be a legal issue. So that's for 2026. But he's been doing this every year since he's been governor. You know, if you look at 2025, so he has a shortfall 2026 of 30% of what the actuarially determined contribution should be, 16.8, almost $17 billion. He's 30% short. But he was 30% short in 2025, and he was 29% short in 2024, and he was 28% short in 2023, and similar numbers if we go all the way back to 2020, his first year of doing this, 2021, 22. So he's really got 6 or 7 years. He's on a roll. He's on a roll for deceiving the state of Illinois. I'm just being, at least that's my understanding of listening to Sheila and others talk about it, who know much more about it than I do, that he's on a roll in deceiving the taxpayers of the state of Illinois, the citizens of the state of Illinois. Is he doing anything illegal? Well, you know, the SEC sued, didn't they sue the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2009, sued the state of Illinois,
Yes.
right? And they settled in 2013, and none of that could be used in a court to say they admitted guilt, but they did say they were doing some things that they would cease and desist, right?
Yes, so the governor isn't unique in this. He, ever since they established this bogus funding schedule, that one of the SEC officials said was a mortgage balloon payment on steroids, and said it really didn't adequately fund the contributions. Ever since they have had this schedule and they've fully funded their bogus schedule, they have underfunded what the actuaries say. And again, it's not numbers I'm calculating. I'm not recalculating these numbers. I'm taking these numbers right off of the actuarial's reports, not my reports, off of the actuarial reports.
Some of these people who are actuaries work for GOMBI, the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. They have their own actuaries, don't they?
Yes.
So
yes.
he gets his own staff to tell him this. Presumably they're being candid with him, and yet he sort of massages that into where we have a balanced budget.
Yes, and what they did between 2009 and 2013 is they said that you are not saying, you may be going ahead and saying you're funding the statutorily required contribution, but you're not, in the bond offerings at that time, they weren't saying, yeah, but that doesn't adequately fund the plan. So they said you have this scheme that funds, that you're saying you're funding your scheme, but in your bond offerings, to be truthful to the potential investors, you need to also highlight the actually determined contribution. I looked through the governor's 600-page something budget, and I could not find any mention of what the actuarially determined contribution is. Now, if you look at the bond offerings before the SEC filed suit, they also did not mention the actuarially determined contribution. If you look at the bond offerings after the SEC slapped their hands, said you're doing securities fraud, you will find the actuarially determined contribution in there. But he's not mentioning it in the budget.
But the law, I mean, I'm a recovering lawyer, you're not a lawyer, but the law says it's not just what you say in the bond offerings, it's what you say to the General Assembly, it's what you say in a press release and a press conference. It doesn't have to be something that's just in the bond offering, right?
Yes, and there was
it's much broader, this idea of the SEC. I think they would say in the law, misrepresentation can occur in a number of places.
Yes, and there was a 2020 legal bulletin by the SEC staff that said, do the anti-fraud provisions apply to municipal securities? And obviously it does. And specifically in that document, it said you can't make misrepresentations in your budget.
So it's possible. The SEC, they have new people. The Securities and Exchange Commission has 5 commissioners. They decide to prosecute. As I understand the way it works, they're sort of prosecutor and jury initially, because they prosecute, they could file a complaint, but then the SEC decides it. And I guess you can appeal it, I assume, to the Circuit Court of Appeals, Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, Supreme Court. But this should be on the governor's mind. Now, is he individually culpable and responsible if the state of Illinois, via him, has made a misrepresentation? Well, we'll leave the lawyers to decide that, but I would give it, Governor Pritzker, I would give it some attention, because you are talking about running for president indirectly or directly.
He's putting the state at legal risk.
That's not a good thing if you
No.
want to be president, even if you don't run for re-election. It's not a good thing.
No, and he, as I say, he's putting them the whole state at legal risk. It's clear in the cease and desist order. Part of the remedies was that the governor and any elected official who's making comments about the financial condition of the government should be informed of what they need to say in order to not violate the anti-fraud provisions.
All right. So, I mean, look, if we've gotten this wrong, if you differ, Governor Pritzker, you're always welcome to come here, give you all of the opportunity to give us your perspective, your view, because we're fair and balanced. Aren't we?
And I would say he's not just being dishonest about the that he's paying the full amount. The other place he's being dishonest is by saying that they have a balanced budget and that it's responsible balanced budget. Can you really, Jeff, have a balanced budget if you're shorting the pensions by $5 billion?
It can't be, because that amount that they're short, that's what you have to put in to start to catch up. So over the next, if you're plotting this out to 2046, which is what the Edgar plan did, it means you're going to have sufficient funds every year, but you're not putting in enough to have that. That's what the actuarial or actuaries determined contribution means. It's a science, Governor, taxpayer, citizens. Actuaries are, this is a science, like mathematics is a science. Governor says he believes in science. And if you believe in science, you have to believe in what the actuaries are telling you. And they're telling you, you're not doing what's necessary to have a balanced budget.
Yeah, and when the actuaries send this, quote, certified statutorily required contribution, in that document, they're also saying, yes, we've calculated this number based upon your assumptions that you came up with, but this is not what is needed to actually adequately fund those pensions. So they're informing him that that's the case. And I was very surprised this year for the 2016 budget, the TRS, the Teachers Retirement Fund, went ahead and said, okay, here's the certified amount based upon your bogus funding schedule, but here is the certified amount of what the actuaries said, if you calculate it actuarially sound. And so he said he funded the certified amount, but he's only funding the lower certified amount, not what is needed to adequately fund it.
Right. And so WirePoint's put this similar to what you've said, but they've broken it down into the 5 funds. But they've collapsed, because they're relatively small, several of the funds into TRS. And my understanding is when they've calculated this, the other funds are the General Assembly, GRS, GARS, and then the judges, JRS, the Judicial Retirement System, the General Assembly Retirement System. I think they put them all in TRS, and then they look at this and they look at, well, that $16.8 billion that's required is broken down into a certain amount that's be actuarially appropriate for those 3 funds as redefined. And those 3 funds are SERS, which is the State University Retirement System, and then SERS, the State Employee Retirement System, SERS, and then TRS, which you mentioned, the Teachers Retirement System. And the Teachers Retirement System is underfunded by about $4 billion. And that includes in that the GARS and the Judicial and JRS. But those are relatively small. And then there's a certain amount that I guess it's about, for SERS, it's about a little less than $1 billion. And then that's SURS is a little less than, looks like 300 million. So the bulk of that underfunding is actually in the TRS thing.
The TRS.
But it doesn't matter, it's the whole thing. It's that altogether it's $5.1 billion, and that's just 2026. You could do a similar thing for 2025, going back, 2024, all the way back, and it just tends to accumulate. And these are the shortfalls that you've talked about, and averages. Actually, we haven't looked at all of this, but if you did, and you've looked at it, but we're not presenting it all, it's about 29% for the last 7 years.
Yeah.
If you take 3 years and then you take 4 years, that's a pretty substantial. The short of it is where we started. We're not putting in the amount to pay these pensions over time.
Right.
And there's going to become a day of accounting, so to speak, a day of judgment on that. And
I would say that, yes, there's a day of judgment, but there's also something that is occurring now. The governor and the previous governors have not truly balanced the budget. but they have came out and said that they've truly balanced the budget. So then the electorate think, oh, well, we must be doing fine. And as somebody who advocates for tax and spending policy, you might advocate one way based on, oh, I think that we have fully funded our pensions, we have balanced the budget. Or when you went to the voting booth last time to vote for governor, he said, I balance the budget every single year I'm in office. Well, then again, you're probably going to vote for him if that's the case. Oh, he's being fiscally responsible. But the truth is that he hasn't been fiscally responsible because he hasn't truly balanced the budget, because he hasn't fully funded the pensions. And if he had to fully fund those, then he would have had to cut services or benefits elsewhere, and or he would have had to raise taxes. Both of those options aren't very popular with the voters. But because he didn't have to make those choices, because he didn't truly balance the budget, people again went to the voting booth thinking everything was fine. Oh, and on top of that, people might have bought in bonds of the states going based upon his discussion.
Which would mean the risk of those bonds is higher than was represented to them because he didn't tell you about this amount that's being put in the pensions was simply the statutory amount, not the amount the science would say, the actuaries would say.
Now, if you look at the bond offerings, which again is a 300 to 600 page document, it is mentioned in there, but he has to be truthful outside the bond offerings also. And also any comment that he makes, a public address, a press conference, a budget, those have to be truthful comments. And by saying fully funded, I have balanced, I would say that those are misleading comments.
We got to get out. Thank you so much, Sheila Weinberg. Truthinaccounting.org. And there's another site for data.
DataZ.org, data-z.org.
Can they find out everything they need to know by just going to truthinaccounting.org?
Yes, and
you
then
can get
that
to
will link to the other
data
site.
site.
Yes.
So there's lots of data. There's data there for the large cities across the country. There's data for the 50 states. Illinois and Chicago rank in the bottom, what do you call them? Sinkhole cities, sinkhole states?
Sinkhole cities, sinkhole states.
Okay, so you come back and inform us and the governor and the taxpayers of Chicago, of the state of Illinois, of the cities around the state.
That's our
More.
job.
That's your job. And you come back next week and every week to Public Affairs.